the war in Israel. I've got James with me today. How's it going, James?
I'm okay. How about you, Morgan?
Not too bad, not too bad. Bashing my head against the peace negotiations as per usual, which is what we're going to be speaking about today. There's been a lot of coverage in the news in the last few days about continuingly exchanged proposals between Hamas and the Israeli government and their various intermediaries. Some of the details of them actually aren't disclosed, so to some extent we're kind of fumbling around in the dark trying to figure out exactly what they are. But Hamas, proposed a deal just the other week, where they, through Egypt, where there were some fairly strong proposals which weren't in the Israeli interest, which we'll talk a little bit about. Then supposedly Israel submitted their counter proposal just a few days ago, which Hamas said they're taking time to consider. They said they're taking time to consider the offer from the Zionist occupation government, slipping that in as per usual. So we're going to talk about that to the extent that we can, and then also the properness of these whole kind of things, what leads people to think that they can even achieve peace in this manner, and why they end up thinking the way they do. So James, tell us just a bit about what's been going on and how you think about it.
Well, the negotiations as such are corruption and the sign of defeat in itself. To negotiate, with these killers of October 7th, to negotiate with people still holding hostages is defeating, self-defeating in itself. The negotiations themselves are corrupt. The negotiations, insofar as they buy any time, delay in any way, delay for 1 minute, the assault on Rafah, which is what in effect they are doing. It undermines Israel's interest. Israel has no interest in doing this. Israel's interest is in eliminating Hamas and making sure that more October 7th do not happen. The entire exercise of negotiating with them through intermediaries has been ineffectual and isn't going to come to anything because, of course, the interest of Hamas is in only delaying. Delay, delay, delay. Every delay they get, oh, we're considering this proposal. Okay, swell. While you consider it, more supplies get into Gaza, and Hamas leadership escapes from Rafah. No, at this point, the assault on Rafah is becoming more and more, even if it does happen, an ineffectual joke, precisely because of these negotiations. As you point out, I get headlines battered at me. Netanyahu's rejected this proposal. Oh no, Hamas rejects this proposal. And very frequently, I don't know what the specific deal is that is causing the problem. But if, as we were talking before, is if you indicated the Egyptian proposal is for a year-long ceasefire, that means Israel agreeing to the continuation of Hamas, a perpetuation of this violence. If anyone thinks that this is in this kind of way can be settled by negotiation, they are sadly mistaken. Only Hamas can gain from this. It's the wider principle, of course, that the good can get nothing from the evil. They exist as a parasite on the good every time. It is only the sanction Israel gives it in even talking with these monsters, the moral sanction that they give it, and even talking with these monsters, that perpetuates the problem itself. You have to call the monsters and say, no, we will not be negotiating for hostages as such. That is only rewarding you for future hostage taking. And by the way, it's the product of all these other hostage negotiations that Israel and America has done in the past. We're going to stop that right now. We're going to destroy Rafah. Now, if you want to release the hostages now, you might affect the degree to which there will be slaughter there. But that is about the only complete surrender, turn over the hostages, or the pain will continue, is really the only appropriate approach that Israel has. To delay for 1 minute the assault on Rafah for negotiations for these hostages is to betray the hostages. We don't even know if they're alive. They've certainly been tortured and raped for the last several weeks. And of course, in negotiating as such, you're only encouraging more hostage taking, rapes, and October 7th.
Yes, and this comes as well as there were, I think, images or maybe even video released of three of the hostages just the other day who look very disheveled, slightly emaciated, I have to say. And I wonder that one of the things I wonder is whether actually seeing those photos of those three men, I think it was, actually brings home to people that those guys have been there for 6 months. I mean, it's an unbelievably long time, day in and day
One of
out, to
them with
have
his
been there.
arm blown off. One of them looking like he's on death's door, actually. And these guys are really, if they are still, I don't know when the photograph was taken, but if these guys really are still alive, they are in absolute misery. If if we care about that, if we care about what's happening, we have to think long term. These people could die at any second on the whim of Hamas. To make ourselves dependent upon the whim of Hamas because of the lives of these hostages would be the worst mistake possible. The worst mistake possible.
Mm. And we were talking just before we went live that the way people respond to this in the West betrays a kind of peculiar orientation. Because in a sense, a lot of people want a ceasefire without even the hostages having been released, and it has to often be brought up to them. Hey, what you're demanding doesn't even have that as a requirement of it, particularly. Now, supposedly, I think in the Egyptian proposal, there's the idea that 20 of the hostages will be released over a 3 week ceasefire before the later kind of year-long one. But it isn't a priority for a lot of people. And they seem to have this perspective of, well, we're going to have a ceasefire or peace at any cost because it's almost a kind of intrinsic good that so long as there's a ceasefire, then at least everything's okay. And you had some interesting thoughts, James, about a kind of theory practice dichotomy that was going on in these people's minds.
Well, not to give another plug for the Ayn Rand Center UK, but for subscribers, we do discussion seminars on various courses that Leonard Peikoff has offered. We're on the history of philosophy, and just this morning we were doing Immanuel Kant, and I was struck deeply by the post-Kantian ethical world that we're living in here. It's as if the theory-practice dichotomy that Kant sort of builds into his ethics, his ethics is totally free of consequence thinking. It's deontological. Good is good in itself. So if we have to suck it up, if morality has negative consequences, well, then so much the worse for the consequences. We've got to do the quote right thing, which often means suicidal. If the IDF is going to preserve Hamas through the course of it, then the intrinsic harm of killing all those Gazans or the intrinsic harm to these particular hostages who might die takes precedence over 1,000 more deaths. There's a theory practice dichotomy built in so that even if Israel has to have more October 7th, even if they have to continue to endure Hamas's existence and rockets and so forth, that's just what Israel has to suck it up. Morality consists of hurting yourself, in effect. There's a theory practice dichotomy, and doing the right thing might hurt us. And if Israeli and American interests are badly damaged, so what? We're doing the right thing. And what does the right thing, though, actually consist of? When you're an intrinsicist like that, as objectivists, we know the other side of intrinsicism is subjectivism. It comes down to rank emotionalism. And so, in the Kant sense, it's collective subjectivism, as Leonard Peikoff points out. But isn't that what's going on as we appease international political opinion? If we're trying to appease international political opinion or domestic politics, if my president Joe Biden is trying to get elected and that's why he's trying to appease people, it comes down to the collective subjective. But we will switch that over and call it an intrinsic moral virtue as we're letting wars being perpetuated, more October 7th happen, not doing the correct thing and eliminating Hamas. Well, that's the theory practice dichotomy. We just got to suck it up. Doing the right thing might mean more October 7th. This is a corrupt way of looking at ethics. It is neither an intrinsic, the killing of a person can be a very good thing, or the killing of a person can be a very, very bad thing, depending on the circumstances. And for that, you need ethical clarity. You need the correct approach to ethics, the correct principles about ethics, what human rights are, how you defend individual rights. Absent that, you are lost. If you are an intrinsicist, you'll end up being this collective subjectivist, trying to appease the greatest number of people's emotions, which is in effect the situation we're in.
Yes, and I was saying that because when we're looking at the way that philosophy plays out in people's attitudes, we're in a sense having to almost kind of read between the lines. But there was a podcast I was listening to last night where very explicitly that kind of theory practice dichotomy came up with an British academic called Tony Klug, has done work on Israel-Palestine since the 60s, since he was a young man. He's very old now, and has been an advisor to the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority at various times in trying to achieve peace. And he very much is on following the line that the two-state solution is what's required. And it gets put to him, well, what do you say to the people who say that that's an impossible solution to achieve? And he says, well, I distinguish between plausibility and feasibility. And what he means by that, like he says it's the only plausible solution. It's the only thing which, in effect, although he doesn't say this, I think this is the right way to understand it, in theory, will bring around a solution to the conflict. And then he says, well, then I talk about feasibility. And they ask, well, do you think it's a feasible solution? And he says, well, no, in the current circumstances, I don't see much will to make it possible. So I don't think it's feasible. But what else do we have to go with? And we were saying just before we went live that that's actually very explicitly a kind of theory practice dichotomy he's got going on there.
And notice the collective subjectivism here. If we have a two-state solution, these people can do it their way, these people can do it their way, they can have their right of national self-determination, which is a total expression of collective subjectivism, right? As if voting a dictator into power would make that government legitimate, right? So there's this collective subjectivism. If the Palestinians want to do it their way, they'll do it their way. The Israelis can do it their way. So we have this two-state solution with collective subjectivism. Everyone gets appeased as if we could all live in peace, ignoring, of course, the actual motivating values of the Islamic world today, particularly the Palestinians. They want Israel destroyed. They are true intrinsicists in the sense that Jew, bad, die, always kill Jew. They've got that intrinsicist perspective. Now, is that rooted in their own emotional subjectivism? Yeah, that's the flip side of that same coin. Notice that the theory practice dichotomy, as you point out, feasibility versus plausibility. Well, what's this plausibility? It's sort of like this Kantian abstract, we're doing the right thing sort of thing. Over here, that would appease us, in effect, morally, in terms of national self-determination and our collective subjectivism. Well, and is it practical? Could it happen with the Palestinians today? Well, no, of course it's not practical. The very idea, of course, that you have to get under is Palestinian culture. We have to change their perspective. Their ideas are wrong. And it's rather than taking their values as givens, which is what we all do, gosh, it's just the way that their emotions are, take it or leave it. Their emotions are built in axioms that we sort of have to accept and can't question. And so what we're trying to do is appease different emotions, subjectively, collectively and subjectively, it's like a quintessential example of post-Kantian ethics playing out in our time. We're told that, Israel, you just have to suck it up. If Israeli soldiers or American soldiers have to die so that we prevent, quote, collateral damage, well, that's the sacrifice we have to do. As if our values were intrinsic, as if they would respond to our compassion, our altruism. Oh, gosh, you guys are being so sensitive to our rights. You guys are trying your hardest not to kill us. That's not going to impress them, folks. They do not share our values. Values are chosen. Values are conceptual. They're the product of thought or evasion, the lack of thought. They are not just givens, automatic, built into Palestinians today. No, we have to call that ideology out. We have to call the ideology out as evil. We have to question that. And we have to, by the way, reject this idea that we in the West have to sort of suck it up to impress them with our morality. As we pointed out many times on the show, they are playing us with our altruist morality. They do not share it at all. They have a savage, medieval, religion-based, racist ideology rooted in collective violence. Until we address that directly, there's no answer to this. And until we get underneath people's emotions, given emotions, until we reject the idea of appeasing this collective subjectivity, there's going to be no solution. You have to recognize that killing is sometimes good. I'm going to say it out loud and with an exclamation point after it. Killing is sometimes the moral thing to do, the morally responsible thing to do. So long as you're an intrinsicist, so long as you run by your emotions, which is the flip side of it, you're going to be utterly confused about this. And it's that kind of moral confusion which is polluting the entire discussion.
Another aspect around the negotiations, which I think is conspicuous by its absence, is when I was growing up, around the wars in Iraq and the Middle East, with Bush as president and then Obama, the phrase which I remember being spoken about a lot, which was "we do not negotiate with terrorists," which was, of course, the kind of sentiment which I think you could fairly characterize along the lines that you expressed, which is that the more you do that, the more you encourage it further on down the line. And that was almost just a piece of received wisdom for a lot of people. It was just evident in a sense that yes, this is the right course. Now, whether Obama or Bush really properly held to that maybe is another debate. But it was taken by people as the evident kind of position. And yet, when it comes to Hamas, who, although some people deny that they're a terrorist group, not many people actually do. Um, People are all for negotiations. And I don't know, James, do you have any thoughts? Why is that changed? Like, is it just this intrinsicism, do you think, or is there something else going on?
Well, I think Israel is in a special position. Israel, see, there is this assumption that some people have out there that somehow we have offended the rights of the indigenous people of the Middle East by creating the state of Israel. That Israel itself is some kind of original sin tainted to it. Israel is not like other countries. Sure, if October 7th happened in Britain, sure, if 9/11 happens in New York City, okay, we can understand you guys wouldn't want to negotiate with those evil terrorists. But Israel, no, Israel's already got this huge black stain against it for its very existence. And I think that is a vital difference between, say, the attitudes after 9/11, when Britain and America were not going to negotiate with terrorists. We're going to get the bad guys. These people killed thousands of innocent civilians on 9/11. So the attitude, there's greater moral clarity, let's put it that way, when that happened. Because it's Israel. Because it's Israel. I think that's different now. And they can indulge this post-Kantian sort of psychology and ethics.
Mm. That's interesting because in a way, actually, the thing which allows them to feel like they can go after Israel for this kind of stuff, that it's a colonialist state, it was founded with this kind of original sin. Actually, a lot of those same criticisms from these people, they do think of the United States or the UK in those kind of ways. So in the long term, actually, I imagine they wouldn't feel the same way about us perhaps anymore, or certainly down the road. And then
this is conditioning. That is, which you're absolutely correct. This is undermining everyone's approach to war, anyone's approach to a response to terrorism. What if another 9/11 happens in London or New York? Will we have a different attitude based on what's going on in the Middle East right now? I think it is conditioning our attitudes. Yeah.
mm,
And I am currently frightened that something like 9/11 could happen in London or New York again. Honestly, it's getting quite scary in that sense.
yeah, and I think it would be unimaginable to many people that after 9/11 or 7/7 in London, for example, that
Yeah.
you would see, perhaps there were some small pockets of naysayers somewhere, but it would be unimaginable that there would be a notable contingent of the population which would say, no, we brought this on ourselves, that we're actually the ones at fault. But I do agree, actually, I'm not so sure anymore that if there were to be an equivalent bombing of the underground, that they wouldn't say, oh, our Islamophobia brought this on us. And
There has been a chipping away of the confidence of the West. One of the delightful aspects of Victorian England was the confidence that Brits had that they were civilized and that they were bringing civilization to the world. And it may not have been I'm not going to defend British imperialism and all its aspects, but I am going to say that there's been this chipping away of confidence in the West, that somehow our values we're not as confident in our liberal values in the West anymore. We're the civilized ones. That's diminishing all the time. And I'm not confident what the next major terrorist action, how we would respond in the West. I'm not.
yeah, and I remember even when bin Laden was killed, I don't know if this happened in the United States, but I remember there was a debate. There's a program called BBC Question Time where they'll get notable journalists and politicians on, right? And there was a debate that was mostly going back and forth between Douglas Murray and a lady who I'm forgetting, but kind of who leans left, right? I think she might write for The Guardian. And one of the audience members asked, should Osama bin Laden have been killed? And Douglas Murray said, absolutely. I think this is completely right. It's justice, in effect. And the lady said, no, I think it's a travesty for Western democracy. No, what a great advert it would be for Western democracy if he were captured and brought back and put on trial and so on. And while she's not, she's saying that he should be punished, right? But the attitude of it was kind of like that we don't have the right to go there and kill him. And it's that there was a kind of weakness underlying it. And I remember thinking about that. There is a kind of a lack of confidence that if that someone like Osama bin Laden, who's perpetrated all these attacks, that we would have the authority to go over there and kill him. And I think by now probably we're much worse off than we would have been in what 2011.
Yeah.
But
Gandhi worked only because he was working with the British populace. In any other context, Hitler would have gassed Gandhi, taken care of it, taken him out, and that's it. But somehow we have this view that if we turn the other cheek, if we go on a hunger strike, if we show them how compassionate we are, if we're willing to be assassinated for our cause, if we can suck it up to that degree, we'll really impress them with our altruism. And somehow that'll convert the evil people in the world to seeing the benevolence as we see it. No, that is absolutely wrong. First of all, you're never going to impress someone with this sort of suck it up altruism. It only worked. His nonviolent resistance only worked because he was appealing to the English speaking media audience. Had it been different, had it been different values, there would have been a different outcome. He was appealing to Christians in the Christian world with their Christian altruist values. We cannot expect Hamas to accept Christian altruist values tomorrow, and our compassion will not impress them or move the dial. And if we keep going along with this thinking, this sort of Kantian altruist intrinsicist thinking that somehow, oh yeah, well, at the end of the day, if we just suck it up and go on another hunger strike and almost die, or our hero gets assassinated, boy, they'll be impressed because we're martyrs too. They've got a kind of moral clarity we don't have in our Kantian killing is intrinsically wrong, period view, or we've got to suck it up and suffer to show them just how compassionate we are. That's not going to change. It's not going to move the dial, and it's not going to impress our Islamist enemies. No.
yes, there's something I want to say about the negotiations. Oh, I should just say we have two super chats. So we have $3 from Jonathan. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and $1 from Bonnie. Thank you, guys. I want to say something about the negotiations, but I think you're right to point out that there's the intrinsicism here, and the way in which I think if I'm identifying it rightly, it seems to blind people to the facts, not only about the nature of Hamas and what they are, but also the history of the conflict. Because when people are advocating for peace negotiations now on the premise that, oh, well, if let's say this Egyptian proposal were accepted, which I don't think it's going to be, and there's a year-long ceasefire, the idea seems to be that, well, if you can get a ceasefire for a year, we'll send in the diplomats and we'll resolve the conflict. Except when has that ever worked before? Did the Oslo Accords work? Did it work with Arafat? And
I have lived on this planet for 60 years now. In the course of those 6 decades, that has never worked. I am a student of history. I can tell you in similar circumstances that has never, ever worked. And why do we think that if these same people have for the last 50 years rejected every attempt to live at peace with Israel explicitly, Hamas is in power precisely because the Palestinian people do not want Israel to exist. It's in their charter, it's in their behavior. You can see it on October 7th. We're not addressing the issue. We're bypassing the issue. We're evading the issue. We're pretending that they have our psychology. It's madness. For the last 50, 60 years, none of these negotiations has worked. And to expect something different, if in Einstein's terms, is the very definition of madness. Yeah.
Yeah. And they end up sounding, I think, if you're holding in mind that this has never worked, when you hear people talk about the importance of negotiations, they do end up sounding insane and just completely ahistorical. But also, we were saying the way in which the negotiations to go to Israel's interests. And I think the fundamental issue is what you brought up about that the good has nothing to gain from evil, and this ends up with longer term consequences. But there's also the way in which media coverage reacts to the negotiations is that, in a sense, Israel can submit whatever deal it likes to Hamas, and Hamas can reject it. And yet, because no one really expects anything from Hamas, if Hamas rejects the deal, you don't see this deluge of condemnation. But then, so at the moment, the Israeli cabinet is supposedly split, with Netanyahu not wanting to accept it, but certain people pushing him to accept it, and Ben-Gvir and whatever, and Smotrich, whatever, not wanting to do it. And
Right.
there's this weight of condemnation coming down on Israel. So of like, why are you causing trouble? Like in a sense, the responsibility is on you. It could be finished if you just rolled over and accepted it tomorrow.
Oh yeah, it could be over tomorrow if Israel surrendered. It really could be. You'll notice that the total double standard here. All the demands are placed on Israel. All the demands are placed on Israel. None are placed on Hamas. Hamas is off the hook on all these ethical scores, but all these intrinsic scores. Well, because why? Israel is a Western civilized nation. We can hold them to a different standard. They're different, and they're wrong if they don't go by our Western suck it up Gandhi altruist standard. And therefore we can criticize Israel. Israel in a asymmetrical way, to use the term they use in international relations, in an asymmetrical way must be more ethical than Hamas. And until and unless that occurs, they are war criminals. They're engaged in genocide. They're engaged in occupation. They're engaged in apartheid because they're not living up. Now, wait a minute here. Is there no racism on Hamas? No, Hamas is inherently a racist thing, an anti-Semitic thing. So are we applying any of the same standards to Hamas? No, of course not. No, of course not. They get exempted, in effect. Their emotions are givens, axioms. Their emotional attitudes, their cultural attitudes are just givens that we have to work with. And the only way we can imagine a civilized Western country dealing with it is altruistically by sucking it up with this theory, practice, morality that they're never going to accept, that they're never going to be impressed by, and it will never move the dial with.
Yeah. And we're in the final 2 minutes, but as we say, they end up, because in this, it's almost like the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, but everyone is, it's almost not like they're pretending. They seem almost, because they've accepted these ideas, they seem legitimately convinced that this could work, but they just end up sounding insane.
Literally.
And yeah, and unfortunately, I think the insanity is going to continue. The Israelis are leveraging that if Hamas doesn't accept the terms, then they're going to go into Rafah. However, given the delay in Rafah has gone on so long now, maybe it'll happen. But I have to say, I just don't feel much confidence that it will. And
Well, every day that's passed, the effect of winning in Rafah has diminished, right? And every day that passes, the ability to do it properly diminishes. So no,
yeah,
I have to agree with you. I cannot be optimistic at all about what's going to happen.
yes. And unfortunately, too many of our shows around the conflict are ending that way recently. But you guys can come join us in just 60 seconds on the Reality Show Extra. We're going to be talking about a not so optimistic topic, which is the protests going on in London. Marco and Richard have been to some of those protests, so we're going to just talk to them a bit about that. And then we're going to look at some of the comments that we receive on the channel, positive and negative, and giggle a bit about those. So that should be a bit lighter. So
Fascinating. Subscribers only, guys. You really, folks, if you want to participate, you've got to be a subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. But what an interesting show that's going to be. Yeah.
yes. So I hope we'll see you all over there in just a minute. Thank you so much, James, and we'll see you all soon. Bye bye.